Dakota Proclamation by Meredith and Quinn, Musa. The rule he is under. The beginning. In order to approach the American Indian problem, you must have a point of beginning. Personal experience has shown that termination was one of the many keys that led to the beginning. There are over 359 treaties, 5,000 statutes, 2,000 court decisions, 500 attorney general opinions, 95 tribal constitutions, and 74 tribal charters that comprise most of the body of Indian law. None of these can or will be able to prove that any branch of the government of the United States has jurisprudence over the American Indian. Or, in simple language, no one has the right to direct, change, alter, or create policy of the American Indian located in the territorial limits of the United States. The treaties between the U.S. and the Indians are treaties of friendship and peace, in which the Indian is the victor. The only rights issued to the government of the United States in these treaties was to remove or keep their citizens off Indian property. In exchange, the Indian would remain peaceful and not make war. The Indians could have, like all conquerors, made slaves of those he defeated. Let's see what happened when the conquered were told that they could retain their freedom and live within the territory in peace. All that was required of them was to leave the Indian alone and not destroy the land. Could be a very good lesson in philosophy and ideologies to anyone who thinks that the white man's intellectual system can ever live in peace. Tell a lie and it becomes the truth. There are three basic areas in the body of Indian law: guardianship, alienation, and severality, which guarantee the total annihilation of the American Indians' legal existence among mankind. The Indian has no rights whatsoever when it comes to his fundamental legal identity. A price you pay for not oppressing conquered people, for not following the habits of the European system of civilized conquest, which are to completely destroy the culture of a race of people different than yours, especially those that welcome you with open arms. Don't try to use that ungodly bit, because I have researched enough of documented history that the question of who gave the gospel to who now stands even. There is as much documented evidence that the Indian gave the gospel to the white man as there is the other way around. So you can't hide behind your God and hope for atonement of your acts, civilized or otherwise. Let me give you the opinions of legal history on guardianship from 42 CJS 20. Indian tribes and their members are wards of the federal government and remain so until Congress terminates the relationship. Congress is free to exert its guardianship in any manner it deems appropriate, provided it doesn't violate any fundamental rights. However, it is for Congress alone to say when and how such relationships shall terminate. And until Congress does terminate or abandon it, the government's guardianship continues. The Indians themselves cannot suspend the relationship without the consent of the government. Congress is free to exert in any manner which it deems appropriate and may adjust its action to new or changing conditions. It may exercise this power even in derogation of treaties' provisions. It has full authority to pass such laws and give the Indians full protection in their persons and property, regardless of where they may be situated within the territory of the United States, and a state cannot interfere with its exercise of such authority." End quote. So, guardianship reaches into the Indian life of health, education, welfare, citizenship, census, land and its development, birth, death records, water rights, and sovereignty. All these rights are no longer the Indians, but are held in trust by the United States government. Alienation. The right to seek and pursue your role of happiness has been blocked by this legal term for the Indian. The right to sell, trade, develop, or give away land does not belong to the Indians, but it is held in trust by the United States government. Severality. Severality means that even if the Indian has purchased property outside reservations or consolidated areas, the government, because of guardianship, if it so chooses, can bring this property into trust. So, guardianship, alienation, and severality are the three basic concepts that the white man has been able to use in hiding the facts as to who won the wars between the United States and the Indian tribes. It is an accepted fact and taught in the educational system of the U.S. that the Indians are a conquered people. Yet, few people are aware that this accepted fact had to have a beginning. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was not Indian, was written so not to offend Indian tribes that had signed peace treaties with the United States and who had learned that the Indian had been most always the victor. But how did the Indian permit the concept that he was conquered? Well, most of the opinions from the Attorney General's office will read within the following concept. Quote, "The Indian who has won the conflict and the demands of the treaty such and such have been met in his request for food, clothing, education, and protection from wandering settlers into his territory for general purposes. These requests can be construed that the Indian is conquered." End quote. Let's at this time add a few more lies by the white man. The Indian and the white man alike are led to believe that the Indian is a full and legal citizen of the United States. He is not. Yet, this fact becomes lost in confusion, resulting in Indian loss of valuable lands. Both the Indian and white man are led to believe that the Indian is compensated for the taking of his land. He is given large sums of money in exchange for the right to assimilate. He is not. The well-publicized monies are placed in trust in banking institutions and are absolutely inaccessible to the Indian no matter what his needs. By statute, no court in the United States can order an examination of these accounts, including the Supreme Court. How to have perfect slavery. These accounts are controlled solely by the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary has absolute authority over all Indian matters in the United States. After his appointment, he is responsible to no one. including the Congress, President, or the Supreme Court. Let's look at some of this absolute authority. 43 USCA 1457, Note 12. The Secretary of the Interior and his subordinates have the responsibility of discharging the obligations of the United States to its Indian wards and have wide discretionary powers in such matters. And the Secretary, in the exercise of such powers, is not ordinarily amenable to judicial process. As respects to Indian affairs, the United States, acting through Secretary of the Interior, is guardian of the Indian wards, and in discharge of such duty, the government acts in a proprietary capacity, and its discretion, when exercised in respect to an Indian ward, is less limitable than an ordinary congressional delegation of power. 43 USCA 1457, Note 13. Regulations made under this section and under Section 9 of Title 25 for the purpose of carrying into effect the statutes relating to Indian affairs have the force of statutory enactments. General power is given by this section and Section 2 of Title 25, Indians, to the President, acting through the Secretary of the Interior and his Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and all matters arising out of the Indian relations. 43 USCA 1457, Note 14. In view of the long practice of the Department of the Interior, the language of this section, together with Section 2 of Title 25, was construed as broad enough to warrant a regulation respecting the adoption of whites into Indian tribes, where Secretary of the Interior authorized subleases to continue operation of oil wells on land of Osage Indians during interim period between expiration of lease and sale of leases 3 months later to prevent shutting down of producing wells. Secretary acted within discretionary powers respond in him under Act June 28, 1906, relating to execution of mineral leases by Indians and oil company, which operated properties during that period, was not a trespasser, accountable as such for value of oil extracted. Secretary of the Interior, in determining whether oil and gas leases on Indian land had terminated, was exercising quasi-judicial discretion, which could not be controlled by mandamus. Quasi-judicial meaning seemingly enforceable. United States held entitled to recover taxes paid to county by Indian ward on lands allotted to Indian and held in trust by United States, though paid without protest and notwithstanding. Government agency informed county assessor that lands were not held in trust, since United States is not or is stopped by agents acting going what law does not sanction. Want to know why the Indian can't get much needed water on reservation? 43 USCA 1457, Note 16. Secretary of Interior held indispensable party defendant on suit to enjoin agents or subordinates from refusing to deliver quantity of water for which plaintiffs claimed they were entitled by virtue of contracts with United States. 43 USCA 1457, Note 17. A court is without power to issue a writ of mandamus to control the conduct of the Secretary of the Interior concerning a matter within the administrative authority of that officer. Where Secretary of the Interior held funds as guardian and trustee of undeterminated restricted heirs of deceased Indian citizen, Secretary had exclusive jurisdiction over them in his sovereign capacity. beyond reach of judicial process, except to extent that they were committed to the court for judicial administration. Discretion of Secretary of the Interior relative to deposition of public lands will not be controlled by courts. Where the Secretary of the Interior takes jurisdiction and asserts his judgment over the matter to which jurisdiction extends, a court cannot control his actions by mandamus, but this doctrine does not apply where he refuses to act on the assumption that he has no jurisdiction. Where there is more than one reasonable construction open to the Secretary, he is free to take the one that appeals most strongly to him, and his action in that regard is not subject to the review of the courts until the matter has passed beyond his administrative sphere. Where the Secretary of the Interior acts within his jurisdiction, the question whether there is error in his ruling is immaterial unless he acted arbitrarily. A decision that the land is not vacant is within the discretion of the Secretary of the Interior and not subject to review by the courts. Certiorari will not lie for the purpose of reviewing an administrative order made by the Secretary of the Interior. Certiorari means writ from a higher court to a lower one, requesting the record of the case for review. The final action of the department cannot be reviewed or called in question elsewhere to correct a mere error of judgment, though a court of equity in certain cases might correct or set aside such action for fraud or mistake. 43 U.S.C.A. 1459. The Secretary of the Interior shall exercise all the powers and perform all the duties in relation to the territories of the United States that were, prior to March 1, 1873, by law or by custom, exercised and performed by the Secretary of State. End quote. This statute shows that Indian sovereignty rights were in full force till they were transferred from the Secretary of State to the Department of the Interior, which placed them in trust May 24th, 1950, without the consent of the Indians. Such an act could only come by complete extermination of the Indian, or, if there was, between the United States and Indian tribes of America, a war. Was there such a war? 43 U.S.C.A. 1460. Quote, the Secretary of the Interior or any of the officers of that department may, when not prejudicial to the interests of the government, furnish authenticated or unauthenticated copies of any official books, records, papers, documents, maps, plats, or diagrams within his custody. 43 U.S.C.A. 1461. The Secretary holds the power of admissibility as evidence in any judiciary and judicial procedure of these records and documents. 43 U.S.C.A. 1464. The Secretary of the Interior may prescribe rules and regulations governing the recognition of agents, attorneys, or other persons representing claimants before his department. He may also suspend or exclude from further practicing before his department any such person, agent, or attorney shown to be incompetent, disreputable, or who refuses to comply with the said rules and regulations. Why not give it to the world? Hey, everybody. Are you still with me? These are just a few of the statutes that control the American Indian in his daily life. Remember this. Next time you visit a reservation and see that Indian sitting hopelessly in front of his dirt hut or broken down house, This control does not stop if he moves to the big city, because the problem has been perfected on the Indian, and he will only see minorities not at peace, nor searching for the solutions, but turning against their own kind. You tell me what hope there is when you're living under total slavery. You say you want to stand up and wave your flag and tell about the great freedom in this country. Wait, I haven't shown you the absolute control over the Indian in education, citizenship, welfare, land, food, birth, life, even in death. This control is kept absolute. We are the guinea pigs for mankind. The spread and control of diseases, both genetic and virus, was perfected on us. The generation gap was practiced 82 years on the reservation before it was given to the white man. What do you mean the generation gap was perfected by the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Haven't you heard, man? Us flower children did this. We turned on. We found ourselves. We are the children of Aquarius, the new birth. You're putting us on. Peace, brother. You're Indian, but you're heavy, man. We've blown out of it. Shit, man, you're a space mind fucker-upper. You just blown our minds. Rap, man, rap. We're ripped. Communicate. If you had ever been to an Indian boarding school, the first concept you would have become acquainted with was that they will turn you against the older generation of your immediate family. You say that your folks are not turned on, they're not with it, or all they're interested in is money, position, and what the neighbors think. The Indian says his folks are embarrassing practicing the old ways, which have no place in this society. Their language, customs, and ways are like the white man says, savage, pagan, and godless. I'm going to be that modern Indian and not practice the old ways. So, as Indians, we start with a communication and generation gap brought on by an educational system that states that there has to be a change. On the reservation, the younger will no longer listen to the wisdom of the elderly. The elderly cannot communicate to the younger because they have lost the basics for the concept. Since the government passed in 1906 an act forbidding the practicing of the Indians' educational system, this system has had to go underground where it still is. Today's ethnic studies language courses, OEO programs keeping the young busy, college students, foreign students, smart students, dumb students, students, tape recorders, notebooks, pencils, typewriters, cameras, classy girls, hippie girls, bedroom girls, prairie girls are looking for an Indian that could teach Indian culture so they can write a paper and be the first to discover something on the Indian culture. The poor Indian teacher can't find any Indians to teach because they're all taken up with programs on how to be an Indian white man style. You don't think any Indian is going to teach you what the true meaning is of the dances, songs, and signs, do you? You've got to be kidding. You find out how many millions of Indian lives it cost in the past, then maybe the Indian will sit down and talk with you. But meantime, you'll have to settle for those Indians that say you have to go to bed with them to get purified and learn what is Indian from the books your former generations wrote. Quote, there is little difference in the way one turns on. The white man has Acapulco gold, Panorama red, and black primo. The Indians have white paint silac, red can heat, green wine, and rut gut whiskey. In the days before the Indian could buy liquor, the Bureau of Indian Affairs always protected the white bootlegger. Today, he helps the beer bar get land from the Indian to push the concept that everybody is to do their thing and there must be a place to do it. What is proven and still practiced is that you know it all. You're turned on, doing your thing, and everyone else older than you don't know where it's at. So while you're doing your thing, guess who's doing their thing? We are speaking of a change of the new world. On the reservation for the Indian, doing your thing is to be a white man and to let the white man show the way. Change your dress, customs, and language. Separate yourself from the old way. Take on the new. Tell the elder where it's at. Go to the city away from your home. Imitate the way. Turn on now. Attend some ethnic study group and learn how to be an Indian by the white man's educational system. Now you can be an Indian that the white man wants you to be. Meantime, this white man will pick your brain and try to find out what it really is to be Indian. Meanwhile, the white man is saying, fight the establishment. Don't perpetuate the way any longer. Go back to nature. Learn how to be an Indian by an Indian. Lo and behold, this white man runs out to meet the Indian coming to town to learn how to become a white man. So we have an Indian trying to become an able white man and the white man trying to become an Indian. Two lost brothers teaching each other. Now, the only organization that is capable of creating this concept is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, having over 80 years to see this experiment work. So now we have demonstrations to bring out the change. Some of the ways the police use in stopping these demonstrations is puzzling the young. But here again, just go back to the reservation. These techniques were all perfected on him. The police no-knock, along with the citizens or vigilante law, has been part of the Indian's home life for 90 years. Concepts the white man is now getting acquainted with. While you are still wondering how much truth has been written here, the aerospace industry has come up with a system and techniques of mind and thought control to be perfected on the American Indian. So there is much to look forward to because, as we Indians can say, this is where it is at. But why the suppression? What has the Indian done that gives all countries in North and South America the right to practice open genocide on all cultural Indians? Could it be that he knows something? It's a known fact that the Indians can prove that all religions have lied to their members about the Creator. So why do a select few not want others to make it into the Promised Land? Could it be that they know the truth about a lie that you believe to be the truth? Freedom or death? Which? Time for America's favorite cliches. What can we do for the poor American Indians? Let's look at mankind's problems from another fact. Since 1776, there have been 10 national cemeteries totaling 250 acres of land in the United States, which are still not full. Around December 5th, 1970, Congress created 23 new national cemeteries totaling around 150,000 acres of land. Trying not to be a dumb Indian, I ran to a friend who was quite a mathematician and asked him a question. How many bodies can you put in one 5,000-acre plot? 5,000 is what each cemetery averages out to. One body to a grave, 4 feet by 6 feet, with 2 feet around each grave for flowers. Put in some roads, trees, statues, picnic tables, and etc. He came back a week later and gave me a conservative figure of 4,515,000 bodies per 5,000-acre plot. Now, who gets buried in a national cemetery? You mean there's going to be an army of people of 125 million in the United States that will be buried in these cemeteries? Far out. You don't have to be a smart Indian to figure out that 4 or 5 of these cemeteries will hold all persons outside of being white. Who gets buried in the rest of the 18 or 19 cemeteries. Purple people? In the beginning part of 1968, the Bill of Rights for Indians became a law, and the legal association began to jump up and down, saying, there are now guidelines to go by. I have always been led to believe that the Bill of Rights tells you what you can do. The Indian Bill of Rights tells him what he can't do. In one section alone, I see the white man imposing himself upon and restraining in every way the culture of the American Indian. There are now suits against the Indian who refused to accept the opinions of white men because it was foreign to their culture. Under these same types of provisions, Title 11, Rights of Indians, gives the definitions of what an Indian tribe and a self-government and an Indian court are classified as. Section 201, Sections 1 through 3, Section 202. Now we have the set of laws that give non-Indians the right to have jurisdiction over Indian tribal governments. Local police enforcement, state police, judges, and attorneys receive the right to create policies in favor of non-Indians. This section gives them the right to charge crimes at a state level against Indians, while at the same time the Indian has still not received the right to present civil and human rights in his defense. The civil rights of the Indian has not relieved guardianship, alienation, or severality by placing him outside the right to defend himself. Remember this as a point of reference. Self-government, foreign and sovereign to the United States, which has jurisdiction separate from the U.S. government. Persons, defined by federal statutes as white, civilized, European, of European descent. Section 202. No Indian tribe, in exercising powers of self-government, shall 1. Make or enforce any law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition for redress of grievances. 2. Violate the rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures, nor issue warrants but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or thing to be seized. The Indian Civil Rights Act tells what the non-Indian can do to the Indian and what the Indian cannot do to the non-Indian. Section 202, Clause 1 states that no Indian tribe, in exercising powers of self-government, shall enforce abridging the freedom of speech. The antonym of abridging, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is expansion, and speech, according to the same source, means a particular language. Whose language? Persons defined by federal statutes as, quote, civilized white European or of European descent. The Indian tribe cannot enforce its native tongue to be spoken on the reservation, nor can it restrict the English language as being the native language of this Indian sovereign nation. Section 203. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall be available to any person in a court of the United States to test the legality of his detention by order of an Indian tribe. Point of reference, persons, civilized white European or of European descent. Title 3, Model Code Governing Courts of Indian Offenses. Section 30. Or is that 301? The Secretary of the Interior is authorized and directed to recommend to the Congress on or before July 1st, 1968, a model code to govern the administration of justice by courts of Indian offenses on Indian reservations. Did you notice that it says Indian offenses only? Nothing on white offenses. Again, we have no decision law to protect the Indian from the white. In other words, there will be no laws on the books So whatever the white man does, there will be no law that says he has broken one. The only defense the Indian and his nation has to combat this type of law is to know that he is not a legal citizen of the United States, which keeps him under the jurisdiction of ex parte Crow Dog and gives him the right to review groups, agencies, persons administering his programs on the reservations. The Great Hope. Look at the Indian problem from another viewpoint. Everywhere you can hear the battle cry, "Down with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Let the Indian control his own destiny. Let Indians run Indian problems." Very good, but futile. First, how can Indians run their own affairs if legally they don't exist? So that's out. Second, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is only an instrument, and with over $2 billion spent a year on various programs, if you remove the BIA, nothing has changed, because the law that governs him is the same. What other motive can there be for whatever instrument that replaces the BIA? To list all the methods and organizations in operation to suppress the problems of the Indian would take a complete book in itself. And believe me, the National Congress of American Indians would be named in this book. This much is known. Nowhere in the pages of history of mankind can there be equaled in total the injustices done to man when one realizes the injustices done to the Indian of this hemisphere. Never has a civilization contributed so much to the comfort of another, such as the Indian did, in providing a government system, a defensive method, a new freedom, his foods, and 95% of his medicines. All that he asked was to be left alone and not have his culture disturbed nor his lands destroyed. In turn, the Indian peoples became a nation without a country, unprotected from exploitation. They became the most suppressed, the hungriest, and the sickest. Never has so much land been stolen under a flag of progress, and millions upon millions of lives murdered from the table of peace, that not even the great Genghis Khan, the pharaohs, Caesars, Nazi, or Hitler, totaling their murders, could equal the number of deaths among the Indians. With no help in sight, his culture will be destroyed, his voice silenced, his race exterminated, his heritage plundered, and his tradition lost. Until his extinction, he will have to live a life of shame, to be known only as savage, pagan, a subnormal human, and illiterate, unable to speak. The Indian is subject for controversy, cliches, and doctorates from universities. But stay away from his legal identity. Why? What could be so bad about the American Indian's legal identity that Princeton, Harvard, the University of New Mexico, UCLA, and Claremont colleges, just to name a few, in their Indian studies programs, omit the law that governs the Indian? Let's put all this down in everyday language with what has been written so far, which would be applicable to the Indian's everyday life. First, the Secretary of the Interior has the power to make rules and regulations on all Indian affairs and in the enforcement of his management. It is the absolute law. No matter what he does, even if he commits an error, as long as he thinks he is right, there is no court that can review his decisions. No judicial process can stop him, even if it is harmful to the Indian. No writ of mandamus can control his actions. Should anyone wish to stop him, he has the support of the Congress, the President, and the armed forces, and can use all of them. Second, should the Indian have a grievance, the Secretary of the Interior can tell the attorneys how and when he can represent the Indian or lose his license. If his actions could give the United States a bad name, he does not have to produce any records, and no court can force him to. Third, even if the Indian went to another country for help, because his sovereignty is now held in trust by the Secretary of the Interior, no country can help. 43 U.S.C. 1458. If you believe there are fundamental rights for the Indian, read the Bill of Rights from the Civil Rights Act of 1968. All it tells is what the Indian cannot do to the non-Indian and what the non can do to the Indian. You are now in the first grade and can get your feet wet in the Indian legal problem. Meanwhile, people will go on believing that the government feeds clothes and watches over the health of the American Indians. Call your local Bureau of Indian Affairs when you hang up. You'll no longer worry about the Indian. Yet each winter, Indians starve, freeze to death, and doctors have their field day because the Indian is a victim of a lie, and this lie has many times cost him his life. But as everything stands today, the Indian is tied legally, politically, constitutionally, and religiously in too small numbers to change his laws without the money for leadership or census. If he were removed from the earth, the decimal point on the population of this country would not change. To be promised a bigger lie by socialist groups that was promised by the United States is what the Indian doesn't need. What he does need is some foreign country to bomb the hell out of the reservations to help the Indian who is now suffering an accelerated program of genocide. Who's kidding whom? But just let us say that there was hope for the Indian to survive. If there was a great catastrophe which changed the course for the Indian, it would never be considered a miracle because the churches of this country have all of them, and they are not to be wasted on the Indians. But let's say that these statutes were changed or corrected and land shrinkage were stopped. The Bureau of Land Management would give back the land they've been stealing and hiding from the public and the Indian, and the account in the U.S. Treasury for the Indian would be audited and dispersed. For your information, it should be around $100 billion. The Indian is told to go ahead and make his future. Now, who will lead this great undertaking? Reservation councils, who have been picked for their ability to hold down and steal from the tribe by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who are almost 100% corrupt? Consultant advisors, look up their records spending almost $2 billion a year with very little reaching the Indian. Everybody helps the lie. We have a change of scenery in another segment of the Crusaders for the Indians. Close-cropped haircut men who have spent their entire lifetime on the Old West history of the cowboy and Indian. A special meeting is called because of this book. I can just see these great old historians with 10-gallon hats, cowboy boots, and Indian bolo ties, sitting around with their faces turning red because most of them consider themselves the one and only authority on this subject. The glorious Old West, the Aboriginal on his horse, feathers flying, painted from head to toe, riding over the hill would be the ultimate image of manhood. If you take their hero off his horse, you've got a fight on your hands. Yet, not one of these persons will step up and state that history, as told, to be continued.